So in the last video, we built a couple of views using Django and using Django REST Framework objects, such as the serializer and the response object that we're returning here. And we've decorated these views with the API view decorator. And what we're going to do in this video is move on, and we're going to demonstrate nested serializers in this video and how to return relational data on an API as JSON data. Before we do that, I just want to very quickly touch upon the API view decorator. Let's go to the documentation. And what I should have mentioned in the previous video is that these decorators, they wrap function-based views, and what they actually do is they ensure that the request that's passed to the view is an instance of the Django REST Framework request object and not the normal Django HTTP request. And also these views are allowed to return a REST Framework response object instead of the normal Django HTTP response. So that's the purpose of what we did in the previous video. We have some function-based views and we're using the API view decorator here, and that takes a list of HTTP methods that we can use, and we can actually make the request to that view using those methods. Now I want to move on in this video and I want to show nested serializers. So what we're going to do is open models.py and I'm going to close the sidebar. So we have an order model and that has some related order items. So the idea here is that you make an order, and that order consists of multiple order items, and that links the order to the products that are being actually ordered here. So what we want to do here is we want to create a serializer for the order model that's going to allow us to return orders as JSON data when a GET request comes into the API. But as well as these fields on the order model, we also want to return the list of order items that are associated with that model. So basically the order has items, and we want not only the details about the order itself, but the list of items that have been ordered as part of that order. So let's get started with that. I'm going to bring back the sidebar and let's open serializers.py. Now we've imported order and order item at the top. We're now going to look at nested serializers, but first of all we have to create a serializer for the order model itself. So what we're going to do just below the product serializer is create another serializer here, and that's going to be called order serializer. Now again, I want to inherit from the Django REST Framework model serializer, and that's because we're going to tie this serializer to the order model. So let's paste that in here, and we're going to define an inner meta class here. And that model, as we said, is going to be order, and we're going to add some fields to this. Now when we send a GET request and we get back some orders from the database, what fields on the model do we want to actually send back? Now I want to send back the order ID, and we also want to send back the user, but that, notice, is a foreign key here. We want to send back the created timestamp, and we also want the status, but importantly we want the order items as well, so we're going to add them in a second. What I'm going to do here is paste in some fields. So let me paste these in here. So we're going to return the order ID, the timestamp, the user, and the status. Now I want you to note the user here, that's a foreign key. So what's actually going to be returned over the API when we fetch an order? Are we going to get the user model in some way serialized? Well, we might need to create a serializer for that, or we're going to see an alternative that actually allows you to link the order to another model by some kind of key. So we're going to see what that means in a second. Now I'm going to extend this later on, but for now I also want to create an order item serializer, and I'm going to do that just above this class that we have here. So let's create an order item serializer, and we'll see how to link them very soon in this video. This one is also going to be a model serializer, so I'm going to paste that in here, and again we'll define a meta class. The model is going to be order item this time, and we need to define some fields here. So the fields that we're going to define are going to be as follows. So we have the order item model. We want to get the product that's associated with that. So let's paste the product in here, and we also want to get the quantity here. Now you'll notice again that product, if you look at this, is a foreign key. So we're again going to ask the question, how is this going to be represented in the output? We're going to see that very soon. But in order to add the nested relationship, what we're going to do is we're going to take the order item serializer and we're going to add that as a field on the order serializer. So what we can do here is define explicitly a field. So not in the meta class, but just above the meta class. What we're going to do is we're going to add the order item serializer, and I'm going to pass many equals true to this, and I'm also going to pass read only equals true. Now we touched upon read only at the start of the series. What this means is we're going to return these order items when we get a read request, in other words a GET request, but these order items are not going to be required when we actually create an order using this order serializer when we send a post or a put request. So I hope this makes sense. What we're going to do as well is we're going to add the items into the fields that we have below here. So I'm going to paste them in here, and I'm going to rearrange this so that we have one field per line. So we now have the fields specified, and we're adding these items explicitly here, and that references this field on line 30 where we actually use the nested serializer, the order item serializer, and we are going to see what kind of output we get when we send a request and pass data into the order serializer. So let's save this, and we're going to go to views.py, and what I want to do is create another view here, and again we're going to stick to function-based views for this video and a couple of extra videos, and then we're going to move on to Django REST Framework's class-based views. And what I'm going to do is just copy this get all products view, and I'm going to paste that at the bottom here, and what we're going to do is change the name of this, so it's going to be an order list instead of a product list, and we need to change some of the fields that are referenced here. So the orders we're going to fetch are going to be coming back from the database. It's order.objects.all, and I think we need to import the order model at the top. So let's do that from api.models, and while we're at it, I'm going to import order item. Let's go back to the view function. So we have the orders. We're going to instantiate our order serializer. So let's do that just now, and again I think we need to import that at the top. So we're importing the product serializer. I'm going to also import the order serializer here, and we're going to pass our orders into that serializer, and again, because it's a query set containing multiple objects, we're going to pass many equals true to the order serializer. And because we've decorated this with API view, we can also return a REST framework response object, and we're going to reference the data property on the serializer, and that's going to contain our serialized orders. So let's save this, and we're going to start the Django development server. And before we actually test this out, we also need to add a URL. So let's go to urls.py. What I'm going to do is copy this one at the top, and we're going to add that down here. So a new path in the application. And again, REST API conventions, we're going to have a /orders endpoint in order to get all of the orders that are in the database. And then the name of the view that we're going to pass that request to is going to be order list. Now I'm going to save this, and let's go back to the browser, and I'm going to go to localhost 8000/orders. Now you can see at the moment we've got the response, and it contains the order ID, and it's got the created at timestamp, it's got a reference to the user's primary key, and it's got a status for each of the orders. Now we expected to see the order items here, but we're not getting that nested data in the response. So the question is, why are we not getting that nested data? Now what I'm going to do is go back to the serializers here, and we've called this field on the serializer items. Now the name of this field needs to match what we have on the models for this to work automatically. So if we go back to models.py, if we have an order and we want to get the list of order items, what we can do is we can give this order reference here, this foreign key, a related name. So I'm going to do that just now, and I'm going to set the related name, and let's set that to items, just like we had on the serializer class. So we're going to set the related name to items here, and that needs to be a string. And now you can see it matches what we have here in the order serializer. So we have a field called items, and that's an instance of order item serializer, and it's going to use that related name that we now have in the models.py file for this order item model. So what the related name does is it goes on the other side of the relationship. So we have the order field here on the order item model, and that means if you have an order item, you can just reference .order to get the parent order. But what this does is if you have an order and you want to get all of the items, you can use the related name. So order.items.all will give you back all of these order items. And now the serializer knows about what this items field represents. It knows how to actually get that data and pass it to the order item serializer. So let's now save this, and what we're going to do is go back to our API. And this time, if we refresh this page, you can see we now get the nested items, and we're getting the product and the quantity for each item in the list. So this is a nested piece of data. If we go back to the serializer for the order items, you can see we have the product and the quantity here, but we could also add the order itself. And if we save that and go back to our page here, when we refresh this, we get the order ID here as part of the nested data. But we don't actually need this for each item, because we know that every single item in the list of items here is going to have the same order ID as the parent order. So that's an example of one field we can easily remove from the fields in the nested serializer. Now I want to focus on the foreign keys here. So we have, if we refresh this page, an item, an order item instance that contains a foreign key to the product, and you can see we have the primary key of 1 and 6 respectively. And we also have a user foreign key in the parent order, so the order is done by a user and the user has the primary key of 1. And this is the default way of representing foreign keys in the REST Framework API. So if you're using a model here, a model serializer that contains foreign keys, rather than serializing the actual fields on the model, by default what you're going to get back is just the ID of that foreign key. Now we can go to the page on serializer relations here, and Django REST Framework has a variety of relational fields that are used to represent model relationships, and these can be applied to foreign keys and many-to-many fields, as well as one-to-one fields. Now the API reference on the left hand side has some of these, so I'm going to click this just now, and it's got some examples here using albums and tracks as the models. I'm going to come back to this a bit at the end of the video, but what I'm going to do right now is go to the primary key related field, and this is used to represent the target of the relationship using the primary key. And that serializes to the following representation. So you have the album, which is the parent model, and the tracks are related objects, and each track in the list is going to be the primary key as each element. So that's the primary key related field, and that's similar to what we can see here for the foreign keys. By default, it's returning the primary key. Now, of course, you can create a nested serializer, just as we've done for this many-to-many field for the items, if you want to actually return data as part of the response, rather than just returning the reference. Now, what's common in APIs is you might get back the reference to the foreign key object, and then you can perform a further API query to that particular entity's endpoint and get the actual data for the entity, but that will involve a subsequent request. So it depends on what you're trying to do with the API. If you want to return it all in one object, then you're not going to use the primary key related field. You're more likely to use the nested relationships, and that's what we've done for the order items. And when you use this, the referred entity, the relational entity, can be embedded or nested in the representation of the object that refers to it. And such nested relationships can be expressed by using serializers as fields. So an album contains tracks. So we have a track serializer here, and that's just a model serializer class. And then the album serializer, in order to actually return the data for each track, has a reference to that track serializer as a field. And it's adding that with many equals true and adding it to the fields attribute of the meta class. And that's very similar to what we've done here with the order items. We've got our serializer for the order items, and then we have an order serializer that adds an explicit field that actually instantiates the order item serializer and adds it to the response. Now I want to comment out the nested serializer, and what we're going to do is go back to our API here, and I'm going to refresh this, and notice that when we do refresh this, the items that are going to be returned, it's not going to be a list containing this nested data, but it's going to default to that primary key representation that we saw in the API documentation. So that's the default. If you don't use a serializer, if you don't have that nested structure, it's just going to return the primary keys of all of the related items when you add items to the fields here and you don't use the nested serializer. Now let me bring that back. I was just wanting to show that. What I want to do now is just quickly move on, and we're going to show something else, and that's the serializer method field. Now I'm going to go back to the REST Framework documentation here, and what I'm going to do is go to the API guide, and we have a page here on serializer fields. I'm going to click that, and at the left hand side you can see all of the different fields that come out of the box with Django REST Framework, and we've got common ones like Boolean fields, char fields, email fields, and obviously numeric fields like integer, float and decimal. We have date time fields, and we have some other ones like file upload fields as well. We also have composite fields like list, dictionary and HStore and JSON fields, and so on. So if you're not using a model serializer, or you have extra data that you want to add to the response, instead of just using the fields in the meta class, what you can do is you can explicitly add any number of these fields depending on the data that you want to return. Now there's one field here, and it's a miscellaneous field that I want to look at, and that's SerializerMethodField. That's a read-only field that you can return. And the value that's actually returned for these fields is retrieved by calling a method on the serializer class that it's attached to. So this can be used to add any sort of data to the serialized representation of your object. In other words, any sort of data to your JSON responses. Now in order to use that, what happens here is we have a serializer method field, and we pass a method name into that. And by default, if it's not passed in, it's going to be set to none. and the method is going to be called get_fieldName. So we can see an example here of a user serializer, and we have a serializer method field here called days since joined. And that's going to call the method on this serializer called get days since joined. And again, the convention here is to take the field name and just add get underscore in front of it. And the signature for these serializer method fields is it takes the object as a parameter. So in this case, the object is going to be the user instance. And then you can do any kind of logic you want within the method. We're going to add that to our representation at the moment, to our serializer. So let's go back to the serializers.py file. And I want to add a new field to the order serializer called total price. So the idea here is that this field is going to sum up all of the order items, all of the prices for each order item, and return that as a total in this field here. So how do we do that? We're going to set that to a SerializerMethodField, and we can pass a method name into that, but we don't need to do that because I'm going to define it with that convention, get_total_price. So let's just go below the field here, and we can define get_total_price as a method on this class. So that's going to take self as a parameter as well as the object that we're working with. And the object in this case is going to be an order model. Now I want to get all of the order items here. So what we can do in order to do that is use our new related name. So what we're going to call here is object.items.all. And that function there is going to return a query set of all order items. And that's because if we go back to models.py, we have our order items here. And to get those items from the order, we can use the related name. And that's why we have on the order model, order.items.all. And object here refers to the object passed in as a parameter. Once we have those order items, we can sum up the value of those items. And if we go back to models.py, remember we have this quantity field, but we created a property called item subtotal. So I'm going to copy that, and all that's doing is it's following the foreign key and getting the price for the product associated with the order item, and then multiplying that by the quantity. So we're going to do that just now. What we're going to return here is the sum function in Python, and we're going to sum up each order item's subtotal. So order item.item subtotal, and that's going to be for each order item in the order items that we got on the line above. So just to reiterate here, what we're doing is getting all of the order items associated with this order, and then we're taking each one of those and we're accessing this item subtotal property, and then we're summing each one of those up. Now the other thing we need to do is take our new field that we've explicitly added to the order serializer, and we need to add that to the fields in the meta class. So let's do that just now, and now we have a total price associated with each order. Let's go back to the API response here, and what we're going to do is refresh this, and we can see now what we get back. Each of these orders now has a total price as well as all the other data that we saw earlier. So that's an example of how to use the serializer method field. And if you want to pass a different function name, a different method name, you can also do that just now using the method name parameter. So I'm going to paste a method name in here of total, and we're just going to use total as the name of the method. And then if we go back to this method here, we can just call that total, and it's going to call that method on the serializer. Again, if we go back here and refresh, we still get the total price appearing in the response. So that's how you can override the default method name. But I typically stick to the convention just because it's repeatable, it's easier to understand for other developers as well. So I just want to summarize things at the moment. We have our order serializer, and we have the items associated with that order being sent back in the response because we've added the field items and set that to an instance of the nested order item serializer, and we're passing many equals true to that. We've also seen the serializer method field, and that's used to get a total price here, and we can put any kind of logic that we want in these methods that we're associating with the serializer method field, and in this case we're just summing up the item subtotals for all of the items in each order. Now we can perform even further nesting here, and if we look at the response that we've got, let's see how we can do that. So we have an order at the top level, and then we have the nested items associated with that order. You can see the product is part of each item, but we could actually nest this further and add details about the product as part of this response. In order to do that, we would create another nested serializer here. So let's go back to serializers.py. Now remember from the previous video, we created this product serializer. So what I'm going to do is go to our order item serializer, and we're going to add an explicit reference to the product here, and we're going to instantiate the product serializer here. Now this is going to work out of the box because if we go back to models.py and we go down to the order item model here, that has a field called product. So in order to go from an order item to its parent product, all we need to do here is add a reference to the product, and instead of the primary key, this time it's going to fetch data as specified by the product serializer. So in other words, for each product we expect to see these 4 fields in the response. Let's just save this and see if it works out of the box. I'm going to refresh this, and this time you can see for each order item we now have another nested piece of data, and that's an object representing the actual product with the fields that were specified on the product serializer this time. So you can see the power of REST Framework here. You can build up the serializers and you can reuse them in multiple places if you want, and that allows you to very quickly take data out of your database and return it in very nested representations using a JSON response. Now one thing you might want to do is you might want to flatten some of this data, and that can be easier for your clients to consume that data. And one example of that is rather than having another nested product field, your order items might only need to contain the name and let's say the price of the product that's being returned. And you might not want to create a dedicated product key for that. You might want to just return it alongside the quantity at the same level, if that makes sense. So there's a way to do that just now, and what I'm going to do is go back to serializers.py, and I'm going to go back down to our order item serializer. Now in order to do this, we're going to remove the product serializer instance from our fields, and I'm going to add a field here called product name, and we're going to set that to a serializers.car field. Now this car field is going to have a source field, and that tells Django REST Framework where to fetch this particular data when we are actually serializing it to JSON. So we have the product as one of the fields on the order item model, that's the foreign key, and in order to get a field from the product we can just use dot notation, and we're going to follow the reference to the product and access the name value on the product. I'm going to copy this to the line below, and as well as the product name I'm going to create a field called product price, and that's going to be very similar, but we're going to change this to a serializers.decimal field, and we're going to add the price of the product in here. And of course, when you add fields to your serializer, you need to also change the meta class if you're using a model serializer. So as well as the quantity, we're going to return the product name, and also we're going to get a reference to the product price here and add that to our fields. Now once we've done that, I'm going to save this data, and it's complaining that the decimal field doesn't have the max digits parameter, so we're going to add the same parameters from our models. Let's set max digits to 10 and decimal places to 2 here, and that should be our product price field. We're going to save this, and let's go back to our API, and notice this time if we look at each item we're not going to get a nested product, but instead those 2 new fields are going to appear at the same level as the quantity field here. So let's refresh this page and you can see that new representation. So we have the product name and the price appearing at the same level as the quantity, even though these 2 fields are being derived from a foreign key from a parent model on the order item. So we're nearly finished this video. There's one final cool thing that we can do here, and I want to show that. It's only going to take a second. What we can actually do in our serializers is we can refer to properties that we've got on our models. So if we look at the order item model, we have a property that we've defined here called item subtotal, and we already used that in the serializer method field here. And what we did here is we took each order item and we looked at the item subtotal and we summed those up for all of the items that are part of an order. What we're going to do now is go back to the order item serializer, and remember the order item model, that's the one that actually contains this property, and we can actually just refer to the property in the fields tuple. So what I'm going to do is add the reference to that property, item subtotal, to the fields in this order item meta class. And then if we go back to our API and we refresh this page, you can see now that the item subtotal has been added here. And that item subtotal is derived by taking the product price that you can see here for the given product and then multiplying it by the quantity for this given order item. So we can now see that for all of our order items. So we've added a property explicitly to the fields that we're using in this serializer. So that means if you define these useful properties on your Django models, you can actually add them directly even though they don't map to underlying database columns. They're just properties on the class, but you can add them as fields into your model serializer. So that's nearly all for this video. We've shown quite a lot here. What I want to do just to finish the video is go back to the documentation, and we're going to look at the API guide here. And again, I want to look at the page on serializer relations. Now we've already seen the primary key related field. That returns the primary key as the related data in the response when you have a foreign key or a many-to-many field. But we have some additional representations that we can use as well. So if we scroll up here, what we can also do is use a string related field, and that's going to return the target of the relationship using its _string method. So for example here, the album serializer has that reference to tracks, and this time it's going to use the string related field, and you can see the string representation of the track appearing for each one of the tracks in that album. So in that case, the nested data is represented by the _string method, and that might be what you want. What we can also do, as we've seen, is use the primary keys, but we can also use hyperlinks. So I'm going to go to this hyperlinked related field. This can be used to represent the target of the relationship using a hyperlink. So what we can do is we can pass to the hyperlinked related field something called a view name, and that's going to reference a view in your Django application. And then if we go to the serialized representation of the album, you can see that the tracks have an API, so we can actually follow that hyperlink and then fetch more information about the tracks. So if your API needs to return a link to that related data, where your client can then take that URL and perform a subsequent request, that's the way to do that. You can use the hyperlink related field. And as well as that, we have a slug related field, and that represents the target of the relationship using a field on the target. So here we have a slug related field, and the slug field is the title. Now if we scroll down to the serialized representation, this time it's going to use the title for each track, and that's going to return that as the nested data. Now which one you want to use depends on your API. It depends what you're trying to achieve with the API. Often you might want to return the actual data as nested relationships, and that's what we've done in this video. If we look at the API response that we're getting for the items, that is nested data. And what we did in order to achieve that, if we go back to serializers.py, is we took our order serializer and we referenced the items and instantiate that nested serializer directly as a field on this order serializer. And that's why we see this data coming back. It's not hyperlinks or primary keys, but it's actually nested data. So we can get more data here essentially in a single request response cycle. Now it's not just the nested relationships we're using. You can see that the user that's associated with an order is still represented by that primary key related field. But if you wanted to nest the user data, you could also do that just by creating a user serializer and adding that to the order serializer as a nested relationship. So that's just about all for this video. We've covered quite a bit of ground here, and we've now got some nested data coming back for our orders. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to create one final video on serializers, and instead of the model serializer, what we're going to do is we're just going to use the normal serializer class in Django REST Framework, and we're going to create a serializer that just returns arbitrary data rather than data that's tied to a specific model in the application. That's going to be a short video, and that's going to be next up in the series. Thanks again for watching this one. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, and if you want to support the channel, check out the Ko-fi link we have in the description. Any donations are greatly appreciated, and thanks very much to everyone who's contributed so far. Thanks again guys, and we'll see you in the next video.